So he was a universal seeker of wisdom in our generation, or in the more recent times. He was in Russia, in Petersburg, and in Istanbul, and in Petersburg he had many students interested in esoteric stuff. There was a lot going on in Russia before the revolution of 1917. It was called the Silver Age. They were inventing new art forms, ballet, new kinds of painting, esoteric stuff. Gurdjieff was at the heart of all that, with one of his close friends, Uspensky, who was a mathematician, and they were discussing all kinds of esoteric stuff. And then, unfortunately, the Bolsheviks seized power with their very strict, narrow-minded Marxist interpretation, according to Lenin, which was very kind of, only, as I say. It wasn't an also type of thing. It was an only Marx. And it was materialistic, exclusively. I mean, I love matter like everyone else. It's great, but as I'm a materialist, but I like spiritual, emotional, intellectual worlds, and I think they're all. I'm an also kind of person. The Bolsheviks weren't, so Gurdjieff realised he had to get out of town because they were rounding up people like him and shooting them. And the Bolsheviks started getting violent, and a civil war broke out between the whites who were fighting the Reds and vice versa. And Gurdjieff took his entourage of students and friends overland to the Caucasus Mountains. He managed to get a safety travel pass from the Bolsheviks, saying he was going on an inspection to look at old rare birds or something, because he was quite good at weaving, ducking and diving, and he got a Bolshevik pass. He also got a pass from the White Russians. So depending on which part they were walking through, he could show the right pass. He got out and he got a ferry to Istanbul, which he arrived at in, I think, 1919 or something. And he started teaching in Istanbul classes on the mysteries, all that he'd learned, right? There, the head of British intelligence in Istanbul, in the attached to the British embassy, was a man called J.G. Bennett, young, very intelligent guy, who also started going to the classes and really liked Gurdjieff's teachings and realised that he was quite a great teacher. He was also teaching dance moves and music, and he had lots of people interested in the arts, because he realised that the arts are one way of expressing esoteric knowledge. Right? Anyway, long story short, Gurdjieff then moved to France and set up an institute outside Paris for the harmonious development of man, which is a great title. And it was running for about 30 years. And lots of the intellectuals of Europe in the 20s, 30s made their way to visit Gurdjieff and spent some time studying there. The one I most in contact with was the J.G. Bennett tradition in Britain. I've written up all this in my PhD thesis because I was interested in who's looking at transpersonal, spiritual impact on history, and Gurdjieff certainly was doing that. He was very influenced by the Sufi tradition as well, because he'd studied in there, but also the esoteric Christian tradition. There's a brilliant book called The Harmonious Circle by James Webb about his circle and his influence, and many novelists and writers were influenced by Gurdjieff, who died just after World War II. Many people came to his funeral, and the church was full. It was the Russian Orthodox Church in Paris, and they didn't all know each other, and they were saying, well, were you a friend of Gurdjieff's? How come you're here? And it turned out that half the tramps in Paris had come, kind of guys that play accordions for a few coins on the streets, and he'd been really generous. Sometimes he'd been wealthy, sometimes poor, and when he was generous, whatever he had, he would share, right? You could always go around to Gurdjieff's place and get a meal, even if it's just half a bit of bread and a glass of wine. And so all the tramps who knew and loved him came to the service, but they didn't realise that he was doing this to all the others too. So they were all friends of Gurdjieff and met at his funeral, which I think is a really lovely, it's the mark of a good person, I think. Anyway, so he's inspired others, and there's a thing in London called the October Gallery. I don't know if it's still going. That was an offshoot of all this stuff, which I knew people in Bloomsbury when I lived in London who were working there, and they used to do art and dance, and I hope they're still going. So I think what Gurdjieff stands for is a new religious movement. This they call it the work, and wouldn't say it's they would just say it's part of doing the work which is universal to all the faiths, and learning to master them all and then to embody them and actualize them. So that it's not just an academic study. If you're going to do the work and follow the work, you have to actually do it as well and walk the talk. So Gurdjieff's dead, but hey, the work lives on would be that position. So I think now let's look at the correlation between the two, because we've got these two traditions, the Gurdjieff work and the Mani tradition. So if we have a line of force running between these two traditions, a new religious movement, one thing we can affirm, I think, is the way that human spirituality is keeps bubbling up in each generation. Mani's dead and gone, he was killed. Gurdjieff was never killed, thank God. He wasn't ever assassinated, but he had to run for his life a few times. He believed in the way of the crafty man, the crafty one. You have to be a bit sneaky to survive in this world, because the forces of ignorance are quite powerful. And so, he travelled a bit, and he kept quite secretive about what he was doing. He didn't tell all his friends everything he was doing. I think one has to adopt that strategy to some extent, just to survive. But in a sense, I think one thing we can learn is how the human spirit is constantly reinventing itself to present itself into new conditions. And there are other people, for instance, the Enneagram, which is a very popular thing that people like to use as a psychological tool of self-knowledge. The Enneagram was popularized in Gurdjieff's circle. People think he first adopted it from Sufi traditions and esoteric Christian traditions, and then it was adopted by others. Oscar Acaso, for instance, in Bolivia, started using the Enneagram, and then a bunch of Jesuits in America did, and now it's a big business. You can do Enneagram workshops and stuff. But it goes back to Gurdjieff with this wonderful ninefold diagram, which is what the Enneagram looks like. I ran a workshop on sacred numbers, which included teachings about the Enneagram from an American friend of mine who was a specialist in that. So Gurdjieff also believed in science, and J.G. Bennett's great work, which was inspired by Gurdjieff, which he wrote in the 1940s and 50s, and which I've written up in the appendix to my thesis, is a masterly, multi-volume study, The Dynamic Universe, I think it's called, which is a study of everything, like the atomic structure, down to the level of elements and atoms, and they all form according to certain mathematical rules and laws, which then can be traced in at other levels. So, say in music, and this is what Gurdjieff called the law of octaves. So reality is a kind of octave process. So one thing that manifests here as music or sound manifests in light as colour, and maybe manifests at elemental levels as geometric shapes and patterns that electrons weave with other subatomic particles and so on. And J.G. Bennett then carried it on and said, okay, now this manifests in societies, this law of octaves. You can have different types of societies. It manifests in religions, different types of religions. And humanity is evolving. We are the sort of leading edge of the wave of evolution. And where we're going to next is what is important, These saints want us to evolve in the path of peace and integration and love, ultimately, which keeps form, which honours form, doesn't destroy form, doesn't needlessly, whereas war, violence, bombing, killing is destroying literally bodies. They're finding bodies in the rubble in Gaza, body parts. I don't want to find I cannot imagine the psychological suffering of the people there finding their children's body parts under rubble. Thousands of them have not even been found. This is a travesty, and it's against all that these people stand for, in my opinion. And it's the same with what Hamas did as well. So I'm not excusing them. I'm saying two wrongs don't make a right. That's the ancient law of love. So I think that would be what I would say as a commonality. And in a sense, I want us to work together to prove Marnie wrong. I want to work together so that the forces of light can defeat the forces of evil. I still hold that hope. And like Augustine, I still want, the wisdom workers to create heaven on earth, which is what the Lord's Prayer proclaims. One of the other people inspired by Gurdjieff, an esoteric Christian, wrote a commentary on the Lord's Prayer in the same way that I've done a commentary on the Gospels. So anyway, if anyone's interested in more detail, look at the book that comes with the periodic table. Subscribe to the table online, where it gives a lot of the detail. It tells you all the Christian guy was a guy called Maurice Nicoll, who he wrote a book called The New Man, inspired by Gurdjieff, and saying, well, okay, shouldn't Christianity come of age and embody that new spirit? Isn't that the whole point of it? Okay, I think we'll stop there. Let's hope that there's enough wisdom in these things, and the runes we looked at, and the tarot of the gods, to counter the ignorance that we're up against as a planet, and that this coming year we can let the wisdom forces come out, on top. I'll just finish with one last little observation. So, I think I mentioned this before. There's an Israeli academic set up a network to study the horrors of the Hamas killings on October the 7th, particularly the sexual crimes done against Israeli women and so on. And that's very important that work's done. But I also want to see a similar thing created for the Palestinians, because they're suffering under the relentless bombing and killing. So we shouldn't be one-sided in this. And I just want to say that the UN has created a commission of inquiry into the conditions in Palestine and Gaza under a South African commissioner, judge. So there are people looking at, I think the other thing about scholarship is we have to see what's going on. That's how we cast light on what's happening, just perceiving. If you're one of the people that care about life and want love to win and want the forces of light to win, then you have to see what's going on. Open your eyes. Don't be one of those sort of people that say, oh, I don't want to know, it's all too painful, and look away and ignore it. No, by looking, you bring the intelligence of your soul to bear on the thing, and then it changes its behaviour patterns. If the forces of darkness know we're looking at them, they moderate and they start to behave. It's like naughty kids, when they know that you can see what they're doing, they tend to behave. I know as a teacher that's kind of how it works. Right, okay. Any questions, any final comments about any of this?
I have found a thread or a story.
Okay.
It began with the gods and what you
Yeah.
said about Prometheus and how Hercules was the one that saved him. Prometheus had kind of been exiled, I
Yes,
suppose,
yes.
in a way, and Hercules' strength and compassion saved him.
Yeah.
And I felt the same with Baal,
Baal, yeah.
Baal, you were saying how he's always got these negative connotations before his name,
Yeah,
and yet in some places we can't even say the name because it is so pure and so holy.
yeah,
So it made me realise that that's a similar story in a way as Prometheus. It's been again exiled, kind of segregated, put in this place of darkness.
yeah,
And then you move to the runes and the day, the light, the dawn, it's casting the light, it's giving the light to the moment, the task, the question we asked.
yeah,
And then if you have the ing, which is, the door into that light, that way of us celebrating and bringing our purity, our truest selves, our highest form into this reality, to then bringing it to Mani, and Mani with Om Mani Padme Hum, like it's a really ancient sound, and it's jewel. It's like the jewel, the illumination, the spark of divinity within us all. And then that coming to someone who was trying to bring wisdom through different pathways and stuff. So that's where I've kind of threaded it into, saying actually that is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to look at these places where people have been exiled, or like the darkness has fallen, and it's up to us to open that door of light in 4. You said it was the 4th Hebrew letter. 4 is your heart chakra, so it's you're opening the door of love into this experience. So that's what we must do, basically. That's how I see this whole continuation, and that is the message from the divine, from as far as I'm aware of what I've received from
I like
this.
that.
Yeah,
I love
so it's stepping into that loving space within these dark spaces and bringing that light through to help purify, cleanse and lift.
Yeah, that
Again.
makes a lot of sense. Just to comment on that, so the word in Bab means a door, and it's the original word Babylon, meaning the door of God, the door of the sacred, because Babylon was the sacred city dedicated to the gods. And in Sufism, to create a lodge in Sufism, all you need is a door frame. There are Sufi lodges scattered around the Middle East, which they don't have a temple, they don't necessarily have a huge, fancy stuff around the walls. They just have a door frame.
Beautiful.
And then they sit around there in prayer and do their, chants and all that. And somebody sits by the door, and that's where Ali's going to come through, the Imam of wisdom, who brings the gnosis to us. And so they honour that. The door is the door to reality, right? And then in the Baha'i tradition, which is another new religious movement, a chap appeared in 19th century Persia called the Bab, the gate, the door. And he ushered in the Baha'i revelation. So this idea of a doorway is pretty primal in all the faiths, and it's there in all the traditions. So you're onto something there, we just need to sit by the door and let the good come through.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Oh, and also we're in the month of January. Janus is the god of the gate or the door in the Latin calendar, which is another sacred tradition, the Etruscan Roman. And we've been looking at the Juno Isis calendar done by my friend Reverend Durden Robertson, the founder of the Fellowship of Isis, and it's all in there. And yes, Janus looks both ways because he's a door which opens that way and that way. And the gate, this is the gateway month, which looks back to the old year that's just gone and looks forward to the new year that's now coming in. And Janus is a very important god for the Romans. He's been neglected. But I'm a great lover of Janus and his wife, who's also figures in one of the goddess books we have here. Janua, I think she's called. So, yeah. What's interesting about studying comparative philosophy of religion is how each generation of seers have seen the same thing. They call it slightly differently. They have different languages, different names, but it's the same thing. And that, I think, is what Jung meant by the archetypes. You know, there's an archetype behind doorways, gates and stuff. In the Shinto religion, that's really important. Every temple in Shintoism has a great wooden door that you walk through, and when you go through, then you're in the temple.
Tori.
Tori, that's it. Because you spent 5 years in Japan. Yeah. And you went to Shinto temples and
Yeah, sometimes.
went through the Tori. Yeah. So that's, yeah. Okay, any other final points? Any questions? It's enough to chew on, I think, for now. Good. Okay, well, anyway, thank you for listening. And I hope that next week we can have some good news. It'd be lovely to have a ceasefire in these wars. And Putin goes on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, decides to become a monk and gives up his war. And Netanyahu goes on a Kabbalistic retreat in New York and just stays there and says sorry for what he's done to the Israeli people. That'd be lovely, wouldn't it? Watch this space.